So what I want to talk to you about today is this magnificent aeroplane, the de Havilland 106 Comet. And I trawled through dozens of photos trying to find one that would be the most appropriate. And I think that the Comet in BOAC livery is just absolutely perfect. None of these ugly ported engines that we have to live with now in our airliners. It was just poetry in motion's aeroplane. And we've got to remember that we owe an enormous debt of gratitude to the Comet because it was the world's first jet airliner, and it took an enormous leap forwards, and in part that was its downfall. But without the Comet, perhaps the progress into jet air travel wouldn't have been as swift as it was. So a quick potted history of the Comet, but the problem was that unfortunately the Comet suffered a number of accidents and eventually it had to be withdrawn. Now I'm only talking about the Comet-1 today. There were Marks 2, 3 and 4 as we'll see, but it was the Comet-1 that became most famous or eventually infamous. And here's the Comet-1, the prototype Comet after the first flight. Group Captain John Cat's Eyes Cunningham, and he was given that moniker because of his success as a night fighter pilot in World War II. I believe he shot down 20 German aircraft. But apparently he absolutely hated that nickname. So there he is anyway, in the middle of that all, the smiling gentleman in his flight kit. And he actually looks fairly small there, but I think the fellow with his back to us in the photo must have been extremely tall, because the others seem to be about the same height. But anyway, a very experienced pilot, John Cunningham, and a very strong supporter of the Comet. So as I said, there were 4 versions of the Comet built. The Comet-1, just 22 of them, and it took de Havilland about 4 years to redevelop the Comet into the Comet-4, and that was delivered in 1958 first. But unfortunately, that was only about 3 weeks before the Boeing 707 prototype flew, and as we'll see, that caused the Comet a few problems apart from its own. So, just a few figures about the Comet, and I'll show you in a graph in a moment. So, about equivalent to a Douglas DC-6, very popular propeller-driven airliner of the era. There are over 700 of those delivered. So it cruised at about 420 knots, but it could cruise at up to 42,000 feet. So that was the service ceiling of the Comet-1. And if you want, you can download the pilot's notes from the internet for about $15, and it's 267 pages of absolutely fascinating stuff. So just looking at that comparison here, and the DC-6 is 1 on this scale. So the cruise speed of the Comet was 50% or so higher than the DC-6, and it flew nearly 70% higher in altitude if it was at 42,000 feet. So an enormous leap forward, not an incremental improvement, just an absolutely revolutionary change. Now, when de Havilland designed the Comet, they actually wanted the Rolls-Royce Avon, which I've shown on the right there. Unfortunately, it wasn't finished its certification process, so de Havilland had to settle for their own Ghost engine. Initially 5,000 pounds of thrust, but all the Comet-1s were retrofitted with a version that did 5,700 pounds. And the Comet-2 was the first one that had an Avon. Now, even that early Avon did 7,000 pounds, which is 22% more than what was actually in the Comet-1. And it could be argued, as I will argue, that that would have made a big difference to the handling of the Comet-1. So as you can see in the cutaway on the left there, the Ghost has a centrifugal compressor. The air enters on the left side, it's flung outwards, it works its way around a couple of 90-degree bends to go into the combustion chambers, where it's mixed with fuel and ignited. then it turns a single turbine, which is on the same shaft as the compressor, and then the jet exhaust goes out and produces the thrust. But on the right, we have the Avon, which has got an axial compressor, so basically the air can flow in one direction right through the engine, and that's not only a lot more efficient, but it allows for more compressor stages and later more turbine stages as well. So to give you an idea of how cheap the Comet-1 was to run, if you filled 43% of the revenue seats, you could start to make a profit. So that tells you how much cheaper the jet engines were to operate than the reciprocating monster piston engines that were common in the piston engine airliners. So there were two types of accident that befell the Comet-1. And I'm going to talk today about the runway overruns. And then in part 2, and probably in the March meeting, I'll talk about the in-flight breakups, of which there were 3. So the first takeoff accident happened in Rome, taking off from Ciampino Airport. And the second one was a little bit later, taking off from Karachi. So that first aircraft was a BOAC aircraft, British Overseas Airways Corporation, as they were then known. The second one was a Canadian Pacific aircraft that was on its delivery flight to Canada, but de Havilland and the British government prevailed on Canadian Pacific to take the aircraft on a slight detour via Australia because they wanted to sell the Comet to Australia. And they felt that if they actually showed the Comet to people here, we might be more interested in buying it. So there are a number of common factors with these two takeoff accidents. And I was going to make the takeoff side of things just a footnote to the main presentation. But the more I got into it, the more I realised that there are some fascinating details here and it deserved a presentation of its own. But the common factors were that the aircraft was rotated early in the takeoff roll. It was held in a nose-high attitude. Now, we don't have testimony from the pilots of the Karachi accident because unfortunately they perished in the resulting accident. But at least we do have witness testimony on both. Now, in that nose-high attitude, that was a very high drag environment. The engine intakes were blanketed, so there was a loss of pressure recovery. And the aircraft couldn't accelerate to flying speed. So here you are tooling down the runway with your nose up like a biker doing a wheelie and not increasing your airspeed to the point where you can take off because there's just too much drag. And the wing ground stalled and started a low frequency buffet, and both aircraft overran the runway. Now I'm going to quickly talk about the Karachi accident first, although chronologically it was the second, because this really was the perfect storm for these poor blighters. Although it wasn't a meteorological storm, but nonetheless. So these two pilots had just been certified on the Comet. 10 hours of training. Now, these were pilots who'd probably never flown a jet aircraft before, and to me it seems almost criminal to let them loose on an international multi-stage flight with just 10 hours of training, 10 hours of duel. Anyway, John Cunningham briefed them. He said, whatever you do, don't get the nose too high on the takeoff roll, or you'll be in strife. These two pilots hadn't done a night takeoff before. These two pilots had not flown the aircraft at maximum all-up weight previously. So in so many respects, this was the sort of experience that you don't want to be having for the first time when you've got a plane load of people. Now, they'd only flown in from London the previous day, so no doubt they were fatigued. There was time pressure because of this requirement to divert via Australia. And finally, it was 3 AM local time. So the two pilots' circadian rhythms would have been at their very lowest point. And quite frankly, it was no surprise at all that what happened. But the aircraft ran off. It impacted a dry drainage canal off the end of the runway and caught fire and was destroyed. So here's the aircraft before the accident, beautiful profile shot of the Comet. Now we know a bit more about the Rome accident because everybody survived it. And one thing that we know is that on this runway, this was runway 16 at Ciampino in Rome, 2,209 metres long, and for the last 600 metres, the tail skid was intermittently in contact with the runway. Now when I say in contact, it was being bang, bang, bang as the pilot tried to pull the yoke back and lift off. It's almost as if he was trying to lever it off on its bottom to get it into the air kind of thing. So those impacts were so severe that they broke off the tail skid bracket and the tail shoe as well, and that was found in the wreckage trail. And in a Comet-1, which is shown there, you've got to be 11.5 degrees nose up to contact the tail bumper. And in that situation, those two pilots must have felt as though they were about to be tipped into the passenger cabin because it's quite nose high. So that was the reality of it, when they simply couldn't take off in this attitude. They couldn't accelerate through the drag. So as I say, everybody survived this accident. You can see the upwind end of the runway in the background there. Aircraft came to rest about 250 metres further on. There was a bit of a mound there that they hit and knocked the undercarriage off. And as you can see, the poor Comet is beyond redemption. And I'm particularly drawn in this photo that little girl standing near the number 4 engine there. I'm just wondering what would have been going through her mind. So that was the end of that particular Comet. So what was becoming apparent here was that the Comet-1 could be a very significant challenge to get into the air. And I'll include some almost anecdotal evidence about that as we go through. Now, de Havilland and John Cunningham were well aware of this, although Cunningham never admitted that the Comet was anything other than a perfect aeroplane in every respect. To try to solve this problem, they tried various takeoff procedures, and eventually they had to modify the profile of the leading edge of the wing. I'll talk a bit about that. So this was the early takeoff procedure dating from 1952 from the BOAC training manual. So Captain Harry Foote, who was the captain of the Rome Comet, would have been using this procedure. So lift the nose until the nose wheel rumble ceases, and then just kind of hold it there slightly off the ground. And here's the kicker. Care should be taken not to overdo this and adopt an exaggerated tail down attitude with consequent poor acceleration. Now, it doesn't in the least surprise me that many Comet pilots didn't think this was a very good idea at all, and they actually made a point of keeping the nose wheel in contact until very close to the unstick speed. So let's have a look at why lifting the nose at 80 knots wasn't such a good idea. Well, depending on the weight of the aircraft, typically the unstick speed would have been between about 112 knots and 127, the latter at maximum all-up weight. So let's say you are fully laden, and so you lift the nose wheel at 80 knots, and you've got 47 knots of acceleration to go through on the runway without the nose wheel in contact. Now, this aircraft had a steerable nose wheel. There was a steering wheel mounted quite low down on the left side yoke, which typically the captain could operate. So as soon as you lift the nose wheel, you lose the directional stability that that nose wheel provides you and the ability to steer the aeroplane like that. The second thing is that once you raise the nose wheel, you expose the aircraft to any crosswind effect. So if you've got a crosswind from the left, the aircraft's going to want a weathercock to the left. So now you're having to correct for that as well as looking into the speeds and attitudes for takeoff. So really, I think this was a very unwise thing to do, and it evidently was setting people up to get this takeoff wrong. Now we have to put the takeoff into context here. In the first year of revenue service of the Comet, they carried 30,000 people. So the first of these accidents, the Rome one, happened maybe 4 or 5 months after revenue services started. So there'd been 10,000 passengers carried up to that point or thereabouts with no problems. So it wasn't like this was an endemic problem that would have affected every takeoff. But nonetheless, Captain Harry Foote, the Rome captain, he was known as a by-the-book pilot. So if it said raise the nose at 80 knots, he would have raised the nose at 80 knots. Now, they soon realised that this procedure was flawed. So the second version they tried was raise the nose at 80 knots, but then put it back down again. So I'm somewhat nonplussed with that, because if you're going to put it back down, why raise it in the first place? And then we'll see what they finally came upon, which is from the pilot's notes. You keep the nose wheel on the runway until about 5 knots below the calculated under-stick speed. Raise the nose very slowly until the rumble ceases, and evidently the cockpit was quiet enough that you could detect that. And then, in those 5 knots, raise the nose to about 6 degrees deck angle to lift at the unstick speed. So you're going to climb out at 135 knots, and then when you've cleared the obstacles, you're going to accelerate to between 140 and 150 knots, if all goes well. Now, this gentleman, I've spoken about him before, Bill Waterton. He was a Canadian test pilot. He was a decorated World War II fighter pilot, and he joined Gloucester as their chief test pilot in 1946. And his first main assignment, it appears, was flying the Javelin, the Gloucester Javelin prototype. That was the twin-engined all-weather delta wing interceptor. And here he is climbing down from that large beast. Now, he had the opportunity to fly the Comet prototype, and he observed other takeoffs from the jump seat. But his observation was that Cunningham and his co-pilot were very busy and uneasy during the takeoffs. Now, we're talking about a pilot here in John Cunningham, very experienced, very capable pilot. So I think if he was uneasy, that tells us a lot in itself. Now, it must be remembered that when the Comet was introduced, it was basically the flag bearer, not only for de Havilland and the British aircraft industry, but the whole of the UK, because the UK was pretty well on the bones of its bum after World War II, and the Comet appeared to be such a success that very large export orders were expected, bringing hard currency into the country, and that would have been just the perfect thing. So initially, people were casting around for reasons that these accidents had occurred. And one possibility that people considered in the beginning was that the gyro horizons didn't display the exact pitch attitude. Now I'm talking about what we now call an artificial horizon, or attitude indicator, or attitude director indicator, or whatever. The second possibility that was looked into was that the Comet had powered flight controls that were irreversible, and initially there was no feedback or feel coming back from the control surfaces to tell you what they were experiencing in response to your inputs. And the third item there that I put into the box is the Comet-1 wing was susceptible excuse me, to ground stall. So on the left there we've got a steric gyro horizon. The ones in the Comets would have been Smith's instruments, but basically the same layout. And as you can see, the pitch attitude isn't displayed there other than by the horizon bar and the guide bars on the side. Now on the right there we've got a modern attitude indicator like you'd see in the light aircraft, and that has got exact calibrations for pitch. So was it the gyro horizon that played a big part here? Well, it seems unlikely because this was a very widely used layout. Pilots who had any sort of experience were very familiar with it. And 4 years later on the Comet-4, they were still using the same kind of horizon display, even though you could by then get the combination blue and brown one with the calibrated pitch attitude. So I don't think that played a very big part. So the second thing that was considered was, well, we've got this Comet, it's like a big American car of the 1960s, you know, where you can twiddle the steering wheel with one finger and you get absolutely no feedback at all, for the most part anyway, about what the front wheels are doing or trying to do. So eventually artificial feel was added, and typically that works by providing a resistance against your control, say the yoke for the elevators and ailerons, that's proportional to the square of the speed. So if you're at 300 knots and you deflect the elevators, you're going to get 4 times the resistance from the yoke as if you deflect them at, say, 150 knots. But the Comet-1A did have variable sensitivity on the elevators. I'll show you that in a minute. But again, we're talking about a fairly low speed regime here. I mean, if we're taking off at 120 knots, say, and the aircraft's going to cruise at, say, 350 knots indicated, then I don't think that control field would have made much difference, if any. So here from the pilot's notes, the Comet-1A, in the green there is the servo. So cables from the yokes feed the servo. This is just the elevator circuit here. And then the yellow item is the gear change unit, which could change the sensitivity of the elevators. So you'd use the coarse sensitivity for takeoff and landing, but in cruise you change over to the fine sensitivity, and that would reduce the sensitivity by about 37%, so that you couldn't make unduly large movements and overstress the aeroplane. However, the big bugbear here was the design of the Comet-1 wing initially, because contrary to what you'd expect and hope, it was found to stall at a lower speed near the ground or in ground effect than it did in free air. So that was not something that de Havilland's was aware of initially. So the Comet needed leading edge droops, for example, the retractable droops like it fitted to the Trident, or alternatively slats, leading edge slats, but these were just not sufficiently developed at the time. So the fix that was done was to redesign the leading edge of the wing with a fixed droop. And here's how it looked. Now on the left there we've got the Comet-1 that's displayed at RAF Cosford Museum. That's the last Comet-1 that was produced. And on the right is a Comet-4. That's the one that they used to do high-speed taxi runs with at Bruntingthorpe in the UK. So if you look at the leading edge of the wing in the left-hand photo there, it's that bluff sort of leading edge that you might expect to see on a Lancaster wing, for example, with the furthermost forward part very well up the aerofoil. And we contrast that with the leading edge on the right-hand wing on the Comet-4, where the leading edge now has been brought down so that it's only barely above the lower surface of the wing. And the other thing worth looking at here is the contrast between the two kinds of air intake for the engines. On the left there, the intakes are quite small. They're a lot bigger on the Comet-4 because it's a lot more powerful, needed more mass flow. But the intakes on the left there are well up the wing, and they're quite rounded, whereas the ones on the right are further forward and further down and quite sharp-nosed. So you can see how that would have helped the air to flow in. And after this leading edge modification was done, John Cunningham showed that a fully laden Comet could be taken off with the tail bumper on the ground. So not that you would want to do that, but I mean that's a part of the certification of modern airliners as well, to be able to do that. So at least the ground stall problem was pretty much eliminated. So the question that remains in my mind is, why would anybody want to get the nose so high? Because the Comet captains and first officers, they were all highly experienced people by the standards of the day. The Comet assignment was an absolutely top-notch assignment, like the Concorde pilots. You don't see too many Concorde pilots who are inexperienced, let's say. It was quite a gig to get. So, okay, they weren't experienced on the Comet, but they were very experienced pilots. The second thing is, that isn't what the procedure said. Nobody said, raise the nose so far that you're running along with the tail bumper on the ground, you know, like a dog with an itchy bottom kind of thing. So, you know, why would you do that? And finally, these pilots would have been familiar with piston-engined airliners, and they would not accelerate at tail low on the runway during takeoff. Even a tail dragger, so to speak, would be accelerated into the flying attitude before it took off. So I'm still a bit puzzled by this. Now, a postscript here. I've mentioned Fred Jones, I think in at least one of my previous talks. He has written this absolutely wonderful book, which you can get second-hand. And if you're interested in the evolution of investigation of air accidents, then this is a great book to have, because he was involved in this from 1941 until early 1980s. And one of the chapters in his book deals with this particular incident. Now, the chapter is headed "One Little Screw," and it could well be said as "one little screw caused all the trouble." And I have a feeling that that sort of phrase might have been uttered down through the millennia in various situations. But nonetheless, what happened here, a very simple thing seemingly, a small screw, and I'm talking small, it was about 4 millimetres long, on the face of the captain's gyro horizon, had loosened a few turns and started to work its way out. And when Fred Jones examined the instrument, he found that this screw was blocking the horizon bar on the gyro horizon from showing a climb. So it was evident that the captain, thinking he was not climbing, had continued to pull back on the yoke without reference evidently to the airspeed indicator, and eventually the aircraft stalled and crashed. Now, this sort of investigation was not carried out with either of the two, the Rome or the Karachi accident to the Comet, but I guess if it could happen once, it could happen at other times, so who knows? So that's something for us to ponder. So we can talk about some broader causes of these Comet accidents. First of all, like so many people who ran aviation manufacturers, Sir Geoffrey de Havilland was a highly autocratic individual. He believed that he knew best, and of course, in order to run a company like that, you've probably got to have that kind of belief. But nonetheless, there was a paranoia there from, first of all, letting too many bureaucrats get involved, but also he was paranoid about the information regarding the Comet getting into the hands of the Americans, because he really wanted to make sure that de Havilland and the Brits stole a march. So the Air Ministry didn't get much involved in this in the development of the aircraft. Of course, as we've seen, the Comet-1 was a giant leap forward. And we've got to conclude that firstly, the wing aerodynamics were not fully sorted. In other words, the behaviour of the wing at high angles of attack near the ground, that came as a nasty surprise a bit later on. The engine intake profiles probably needed more work as well. Again, particularly in that high angle of attack regime. And finally, de Havilland couldn't get the engine that they wanted for the Comet. They had to settle for the Ghost. And I think if they had another 22% power, the aircraft might have been able to power itself out of some of these situations a bit more readily. Now, there's part 2 here, but not today. And as we'll see, the takeoff issues were not the only problem area. So just to put things into context here, it took de Havilland 4 years to redevelop the Comet into the Comet-4, and even then, the aeroplane could only carry 81 passengers. And contrast that with the first full production Boeing 707 that could carry 174 and even initially do it over a longer range. So really, unless they'd been able to make the Comet carry a lot more people, it was probably going to succumb to that competition. So I've got quite a few references here because there's a lot of information out there and a lot of it's actually contradictory. So it was very much a matter of working my way through and saying, well, look, this couldn't be right, but that makes more sense. And these will all be in the video that Steve will produce. So look, thank you very much for today. It's been a pleasure and an honour to talk to you.